The letter had my name printed at the bottom, in a signature I never wrote. I found it by accident, tucked inside a stack of hospital donation mailers that a nurse named Bethany Sherman dropped on my desk, with her jaw set so tight I thought she'd cracked a tooth. "I won't lie for you," she said, and for a second, I thought she was talking to herself. She wasn't. She slid the letter across the desk and told me to read the last paragraph twice. My hand was shaking before I got through the first line, because the words underneath my forged name promised grieving families that 100% of their gifts went straight to children, like the ones I treat every day in my exam rooms. I had never asked for $1. I had never signed a single one of these letters, and when I finally understood whose handwriting had traced the loops of my signature well enough to fool a bank teller, the person I pictured wasn't a stranger, wasn't a con artist off the street. It was my own mother-in-law, sitting 3 feet from my son at Sunday dinner every week of his life, smiling at me over the green beans like nothing in this world was wrong. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Renee Winters. I'm 43 years old, a pediatrician here in Charlotte, and for the better part of 2 decades, I have built my whole professional life on one simple currency: trust. Parents hand me their children when those children are at their most fragile, and they do it because they believe I will never use that fragility for anything but healing. So when a nurse I've worked beside for 6 years walked into my office holding proof that someone had used my name, my reputation, and the faces of my own patients to raise money that never touched a single sick child, I felt something in my chest go cold in a way I didn't have a word for yet. The questions came fast, and none of them had easy answers. How long had my mother-in-law been doing this? Was my father-in-law involved, or was he as blind to it as I had been at every holiday table for the last 9 years? And the one that kept circling back, no matter how many times I tried to push it down, if I exposed her, would I be saving my patients' families from being used again? Or would I be handing my husband the ugliest truth about his own mother, one he could never unknow? My son still called her Grandma Jerry and ran to her the second she walked through our door. I didn't have an answer yet for what any of this would cost him. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who my mother-in-law has always been to this family, and why nobody, including me, ever thought to look at her twice. My mother-in-law has spent the better part of 30 years being the woman other people's crises orbit around. When my husband's cousin lost her job, my mother-in-law organized the meal train. When a family 2 streets over lost their house to a fire, she was the one who filled a moving truck with donated furniture before the smoke had even cleared. She built her identity, publicly and privately, around being the person who shows up. My father-in-law, by contrast, has always been quieter, gentler, a retired high school shop teacher who spends his days now restoring old radios in the garage and letting his wife run the emotional weather of the household. Between the two of them, I never once had reason to doubt where the family's moral center lived. I married into this family 9 years ago, and from the very first Thanksgiving, my mother-in-law made it clear she considered my medical career a kind of family asset, something to be proud of, something to mention to her book club, something to fold into her own sense of purpose. My daughter-in-law, the doctor who saves children, she used to say, squeezing my arm at church functions, at school fundraisers, at the annual holiday bazaar the neighborhood puts on every December. I never minded it. I assumed it was pride. I had no reason yet to think it was something else. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that 18 months ago, my father-in-law's small appliance repair shop, the one he ran for extra income after retirement, took out a loan against their house to cover a slow season that never turned around. 6 months after that, the bank started sending notices. My mother-in-law, who has never in her life been able to sit still while a problem festered, decided she would not let her husband lose the house he built with his own hands, and she would not humiliate him by asking their son and daughter-in-law for money outright. So she found what she believed was a bloodless solution. She would raise the money herself, quietly, using the one asset in the family nobody would ever think to question: my name. Charlotte is not a small town, but the particular pocket of it my in-laws have lived in for 3 decades, functions like one. Everyone at their church knows everyone else's business, or thinks they do, and my mother-in-law has always been fluent in that specific currency. The casseroles, the prayer chains, the group texts that move faster than any official announcement ever could. She has never needed to raise her voice to get a room's attention. She simply mentions a need, softly, almost as an aside, and watches the room reorganize itself around solving it. It is, I have always believed, a genuine gift. I never once considered that a gift like that could curdle into something else entirely, if it was ever aimed at a problem too large, too personal, and too embarrassing for her to admit out loud. It started small, she would later tell me, with a single mailer sent to 12 of her church friends, using a stock photo of a child in a hospital gown, and a paragraph of borrowed language about a fictional Winters Family Children's Care Fund. When that first batch of checks came in faster and larger than she expected, she stopped using stock photos. She started using real ones, photographs of my actual patients that she had somehow gotten access to through channels she has still, even now, refused to fully explain. And she started forging my signature at the bottom of every letter. Because a hand-signed note from the doctor tripled the response rate, she told herself, every single time, that this was the last batch. It never was. I want to be honest about something, because this story only works if I am. I did not catch any of it. Not the first mailer, not the 20th, not the slow trickle of comments from acquaintances thanking me for the fund I had never heard of. I was working 60-hour weeks. I was raising an 8-year-old and a 15-year-old. My daughter Nora was 15 and buried in her own world of exams and friend group politics. And my son Elijah was 8 and still young enough that most of my time with him went to bedtime routines and homework checks, rather than paying close attention to which of my in-laws' church acquaintances had started smiling at me a little too warmly at the grocery store. I was, in every sense that mattered to me at the time, too tired to notice that my own mother-in-law had quietly built a small, sincere, catastrophic fraud out of my good name. Looking back now, there were signs. A woman at a school fundraiser once thanked me effusively for everything the fund had done for the Hendricks boy, and I remember smiling politely and assuming she had me confused with someone else because I genuinely could not place what fund she meant. My mother-in-law, standing beside me at the time, had laughed it off with a light touch on the woman's arm and steered the conversation elsewhere before I could ask a single clarifying question. I didn't think anything of it. I have replayed that exact moment in my head more times than I can count since, wondering how many other small redirections, like that one I simply never noticed, because I trusted the person doing the redirecting completely. That trust was about to collide, head first, with a nurse who does not know how to look the other way. The Tuesday everything cracked open started like any other. I was 3 patients into my afternoon schedule when my nurse, Bethany Sherman, knocked twice on my office door and closed it behind her, instead of leaving it open the way she always does between rooms. She's the kind of nurse who hums while she charts and remembers every parent's coffee order, so the silence coming off her that afternoon didn't fit. She set a manila envelope on my desk without a word and stood there with her arms crossed, waiting. Inside were 4 donation letters, each one addressed to a different family in the church directory, each one printed on stationery I did not recognize, each one signed at the bottom with my name, in handwriting that was close enough to fool anyone who wasn't me. My own hands went cold before my brain caught up to what I was looking at. "Where did you get these?" I asked her, and my voice came out flatter than I meant it to. "A patient's grandmother brought them to the front desk this morning," Bethany said. "She wanted to thank you personally for the fund. She said her grandson's photo was on the letter she got in the mail." I pulled his chart. "Renee, that's Marcus Del Vecchio's photo, the one from his cochlear implant follow-up. Nobody signed a release for that photo to leave this building." I felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does right before you understand something you can't take back. "There is no fund," I said. "I've never run a fund. I don't even know what this is." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm standing here, instead of calling the hospital's compliance office first. I wanted to give you the chance to tell me I'm wrong before I do anything else with this. I want to be honest about the several seconds that followed, because they matter. Some small, cowardly part of me wondered whether I could make this disappear quietly, chalk it up to a misunderstanding, protect whoever was behind it, without even knowing yet who that was. But Bethany was watching my face too closely for me to hide behind anything, and I have spent my whole career telling parents that the truth, however frightening, is always the safer choice. I owed myself the same honesty. Give me 48 hours, I told her, not to bury it, to find out who did this and why, before it becomes a headline instead of a conversation. Bethany's jaw tightened, and she picked the envelope back up off my desk, like she didn't quite trust leaving it there. 48 hours, she repeated. Renee, if this touches patient photos without consent, that's not just embarrassing. That's a HIPAA problem. That's a problem that doesn't stay quiet, no matter how much time you give it. I know what it is, I said, sharper than I meant. She didn't flinch, which told me she'd expected that from me, and had already decided it wouldn't change her mind. I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to let me find out if this is malice or something else before either of us decides how loud this needs to get. She held my eyes for a long moment, then nodded once. 48 hours. Then I go to compliance, whether you found your answer or not. If you've ever had a colleague choose integrity over comfort right in front of you, you already know how much it can shake a person loose from their own denial. Tell us in the comments if you've ever had someone hold you accountable when it would have been easier for them to look away. After Bethany left my office, I called the front desk and asked them to pull the release forms for every patient photograph that had ever left the building through the hospital's own fundraising office, just in case the answer turned out to be simpler and less personal than what I was already afraid of. Every form came back clean. Every photo that had ever legitimately left our system for any hospital-sanctioned purpose had a signed consent on file, dated, witnessed, accounted for. Whatever had happened to Marcus Del Vecchio's photograph had not gone through any channel my own hospital controlled, which meant I was no longer looking for a careless coworker or an overzealous volunteer. I was looking for someone with access to me personally. I sat alone with the letters for a long time after that before I let myself think about who else had access to my name, my signature, and photographs I never authorized anyone to use. I thought about the fundraising office at the hospital, about the volunteer coordinators, about anyone who might have handled patient images in the last year. And then, almost against my will, I thought about the woman who has called me the doctor who saves children at every family gathering for 9 years, who has always known exactly which photos of my patients I keep framed on my desk, who visits my office more often than any other member of my extended family, ostensibly just to bring me coffee and check on her grandchildren's pediatrician. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself there were a dozen more likely explanations. But that night, when my mother-in-law called to ask, almost too casually, whether the church fund letters had gone out smoothly, I stood in my kitchen holding the phone against my ear, watching my son do his math homework at the counter, and I felt the floor of my own family quietly give way beneath me. "What fund letters, Geraldine?" I said, keeping my voice even for Elijah's sake. There was a pause on the other end of the line, just half a second too long to be nothing. "Oh, just something for the church bazaar," she said. "Never mind, sweetheart. I'll explain when I see you Sunday." She hung up before I could ask a single follow-up question, and I stood there in my own kitchen, with my son's pencil scratching against paper 6 feet away from me, realizing that whatever explaining Sunday meant, I was about to walk into it, already holding proof that something in this family had gone very wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake next to Nathaniel, who had come home late from a work trip and had no idea anything was wrong yet, and I ran through every version of the conversation I might have with his mother. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I finally admitted to myself that I wasn't going to wait until Sunday. 48 hours felt like an eternity, with Bethany's deadline already ticking, and every hour I spent pretending everything was normal at my own kitchen counter felt like a small betrayal of the trust my patients' families had placed in a name that wasn't mine to lend out. I didn't wait until Sunday. I couldn't. The next afternoon, I drove to my in-laws' house during my lunch break instead of eating, the donation letters folded into my coat pocket like something radioactive. My father-in-law answered the door in his shop apron, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, and the second he saw my face, he called over his shoulder for his wife without me having to ask. My mother-in-law came around the corner from the kitchen, already talking, already smiling, already reaching for a hug I didn't return. When she felt my body stay rigid against hers, she pulled back, and her smile faltered, for the first time in 9 years of knowing her. I laid the letters out on the kitchen table between us instead of speaking, the same way Bethany had laid them on my desk, because I wanted her to have the same wordless, sinking moment I'd had. She looked down at them, and I watched every excuse cross her face before she chose one. "It's not what it looks like," she started. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said. "You signed my name. You used a photo of a patient who never consented to have his image leave that building. Geraldine, do you understand what you've actually done here?" "I was trying to save your father-in-law's shop," she said, and her voice cracked on the word father-in-law, like it cost her something to say it out loud in front of him. Harold's rag went still in his hands. He was looking at her now, the way you look at someone you thought you knew completely. "You could have told us," I said. "You could have told Nathaniel. You could have told me. Instead, you forged a signature and put a child's medical photo in the mail without permission, and now a nurse at my hospital has proof of it, sitting in an envelope, 48 hours from walking it into compliance." "I only ever meant to raise enough to cover one bad quarter," she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely small, sitting there at her own kitchen table, with her hands pressed flat against the wood, like she needed it to hold her up. Then it kept working, and I told myself I'd stop the moment the shop was safe again. I never touched a cent of what came in for anything but the mortgage payment. I have every receipt, Renee. Every single one. "That's not the point," I said, and my own voice shook now too. "The point is that people gave money believing it went to sick children, and it went to pay off a loan instead. The point is that you used my name and my patients without asking either of us. Receipts don't fix that." Harold finally spoke, quiet in the way he always is, but his voice had an edge in it I had never heard directed at his wife before. "Geraldine, how long?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. 14 months. The kitchen went silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator, and I watched Harold set his greasy rag down on the counter with a careful, deliberate motion, like he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't reaching for her. If you've ever discovered that someone you trusted completely had been carrying a secret this size for over a year, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling us how you would have reacted sitting at that table. We read every single one of them. Nobody said anything else for a long moment. Geraldine reached for the letters on the table, and I moved my hand to cover them before she could, an instinct I didn't fully understand until later. Some part of me needed to be the one holding the evidence, not her, at least until I decided what came next. She noticed. Her hand pulled back slowly, and something passed over her face that looked almost like relief, as though a part of her had been waiting 9 years for someone to finally take the decision out of her hands. I left their house that afternoon without eating lunch, without resolving anything, and without telling either of them what I planned to do next, because I genuinely didn't know yet. I drove straight back to the hospital instead of home, and I spent the rest of my shift only half present with my patients, running numbers in my head. 14 months, dozens of letters, at minimum, an unknown number of families who believed, in good faith, that their money was buying medicine and equipment for children instead of paying down a repair shop's second mortgage. That evening, Bethany found me still at my desk, an hour after my shift ended, staring at nothing. She didn't say, "I told you so," and I have never appreciated restraint from another human being more than I did in that moment. "Did you find your answer?" she asked, leaning against my doorframe instead of coming all the way in. "I found it," I said. "It's worse than a con artist, and somehow that makes it harder, not easier." "Family," Bethany said, not as a question. "My mother-in-law." I told her the whole thing. The shop, the loan, the 14 months, the receipts Geraldine swore she'd kept for every dollar. Bethany listened without interrupting, arms folded, one shoulder against the frame, and when I finished, she exhaled slowly through her nose. "I still have to report the photo usage," she said. "That part isn't optional, Renee, and I meant what I told you. I won't lie for you, and I definitely won't lie for her. But I can control how I frame it. I can flag it as an unauthorized use of a patient image under investigation by the family, rather than naming a suspect outright, and give you room to make this right with the families she solicited before this becomes a hospital board matter." "Why would you do that for me?" I asked, genuinely unsure of the answer. "Because you didn't try to talk me out of reporting it," she said. "You asked for time to find the truth, not time to hide it. That's the only reason I'm still standing in this doorway, instead of already in compliance's office." She paused at the door on her way out. "You have until Monday. After that, it's out of both our hands." I sat with that deadline for a long time after she left, turning over every version of what came next. Return the money quietly, and hope no one asked questions. Expose everything publicly, and let Geraldine face whatever consequences followed, regardless of what it did to Nathaniel, to Nora, to Elijah, to a marriage I had spent 9 years building around the idea that I had married into a family I could trust completely. Neither option felt like justice. Both of them felt like a different kind of loss. I picked Elijah up from his after-school program that evening, still turning the numbers over in my head, and when he climbed into the back seat, chattering about a science project involving baking soda volcanoes, I made myself smile and ask the right follow-up questions, because 8-year-olds deserve a mother who is present, even when her own family is quietly falling apart around her. He mentioned, almost in passing, that Grandma Jerry had promised to help him build a bigger volcano than anyone else's in his class. And something in my chest tightened at how easily he still trusted her, completely unaware of anything I now knew. I said nothing to correct him, because an 8-year-old doesn't need to carry the weight his mother was carrying that night, and some part of me wasn't ready yet to decide how much of this he would ever need to know at all. That night, after both kids were finally asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and tried to make a list of everyone the 14 months of letters might have touched. Church members, co-workers, distant relatives, strangers with generous hearts and no reason to doubt a doctor's signature. The list grew longer than I expected, and longer than I could finish before exhaustion won out and I finally went to bed, no closer to a plan than I had been standing in my in-laws' kitchen that afternoon. What I didn't yet know, lying awake next to Nathaniel with my hands still faintly trembling under the blanket, was that the 14 months Geraldine had confessed to were not the whole truth, and that the real number, when it finally surfaced 2 days later, would change everything I thought I understood about who had known, and for how long. The real number surfaced on Friday, and it didn't come from Geraldine. It came from my husband. I got home from a double shift to find Nathaniel sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop open and a look on his face I hadn't seen since the year his father's business first started struggling. He turned the screen toward me without a greeting. It was a spreadsheet. His mother's, apparently, recovered from a shared cloud folder the two of them had used years ago to split holiday gift budgets and never bothered to close. "I found this an hour ago," he said. "Renee, it doesn't start 14 months ago. It starts 2.5 years ago." I sat down across from him slowly, the letters from earlier in the week suddenly feeling small compared to what I was looking at now. Line after line, dated back well before Harold's shop ever took out its loan, tracking donations solicited under my name for a cause that, in the earliest entries, wasn't even the shop. It was a family 2 streets over from my in-laws, the Escobars, whose youngest daughter had needed a surgery their insurance wouldn't fully cover. My mother-in-law had run the exact same scheme for them first, quietly, successfully, and had apparently decided, once it worked, that she had found a tool she was allowed to keep using whenever she judged someone deserving enough. I scrolled through the entries myself, my finger moving down the trackpad slower and slower as the dates climbed backward, past Harold's loan, past the shop's first missed payment, all the way to a period when nothing in this family had been in visible crisis at all. Whatever this had started as, It hadn't started as an emergency rescue. It had started as something else entirely, and I needed to understand what before I could decide what to do with any of it. "You knew about this folder," I said, and I heard my own voice go tight in a way that surprised me. "How long have you had access to see this?" Nathaniel's hands were flat on the table, not moving, like he was bracing for something. "I didn't know what it was until tonight. I swear that to you. But Renee, I knew something was wrong months ago. I saw a deposit in my parents' account, bigger than anything Dad's shop could explain, and when I asked my mother about it, she brushed me off, and I let her. I told myself it wasn't my business. I didn't push, because some part of me didn't want to know. 'You're my husband,' I said, and my voice cracked in a way I hated. 'You knew something didn't add up, and you let it keep happening instead of telling me.' 'I didn't know it was your name she was using,' he said, and for the first time his composure slipped, his jaw tightening the same way his father's had 2 nights before. 'If I had known that, Renee, I promise you I would have said something the same hour I found out. I thought, God, I don't even know what I thought. I thought it was some kind of family loan arrangement. I didn't imagine my mother capable of what's actually on this screen.' 'She's been doing this for 2.5 years, I said, mostly to myself, watching the dates scroll past on the spreadsheet. 'The Escobar's daughter, my patients, my signature, and you sat on a bad feeling about it, for months, because it was easier than asking a hard question. If you've ever had someone in your own family choose silence over an uncomfortable conversation, and later found out what that silence cost, share this video with someone who'd understand exactly what that feels like. It means more to us than you know.' Nathaniel closed the laptop, slow and deliberate, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. When he finally spoke again, his voice had steadied, but something in it had changed permanently. 'I'm not going to defend what she did. I can't. But I need you to understand something about my mother that I think explains it without excusing it. She has never once in her life known how to ask for help without feeling like she'd failed at something, not for herself, and not for anyone she loves. What she did was wrong. It was fraud, and it used your name, and it used real children's images without permission, and none of that is defensible. But it didn't come from greed, Renee. It came from a woman who has spent her whole life believing that needing rescue is a form of weakness, and who found a way to rescue people without ever once admitting she couldn't do it any other way.' I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over against everything I now knew. It didn't erase the fraud. It didn't return a single unauthorized photograph to the family who never consented to it leaving my hospital. But it complicated the clean, simple anger I had been carrying since Tuesday, and I hated how much room it made for something closer to grief than rage. 'I have until Monday,' I said finally. 'Bethany's giving me that long, before she has to report it to compliance, regardless of what I decide. After that, it's a hospital board matter, not a family one.' Nathaniel looked at me across the table, and for the first time all night, he looked less like a man defending his mother and more like a man watching the woman he married carry a weight he had helped create by staying quiet too long. 'What do you need from me before Monday?' he asked. 'Not to fix it. I know I can't fix it. What do you need?' 'I need you to come with me to your parents' house tomorrow,' I said. 'Not to defend her, not to explain her away to me again. I need you standing next to me while I ask her about the Escobars, and I need you to actually hear the answer, instead of finding a reason to feel sorry for her before she's even finished speaking.' Nathaniel nodded slowly, and for once he didn't offer a defense of his mother to soften the request. 'I'll be there,' he said, 'and Renee, whatever she says tomorrow, I'm not going to ask you to forgive her on any timeline but your own. I think I owe you that much, at minimum, for the months I spent not asking questions I should have asked.' I didn't have a full answer yet about what came next, or about how much of my trust in this family I would ever get back, but I knew I needed him to stop protecting his mother's comfort at the expense of the truth, starting that night, and I told him exactly that. I made my decision 2 days before the deadline, sitting alone in my car in the hospital parking garage during a break I wasn't supposed to be taking. I called Bethany first. 'I'm not asking you to bury anything,' I told her. 'I need you to report exactly what happened, the way you were always going to. But I'm asking for one thing before you do. Let me be the one who reaches every family who ever received one of those letters, before compliance's investigation becomes the first thing they hear about it." There was a pause on the line, and when Bethany spoke again, her voice had lost the edge it carried in my office on Tuesday. "I can give you until the report goes in Monday morning. That's not me bending the rule, Renee. That's just how long the process actually takes on my end anyway. Use it well." Nathaniel came with me to his parents' house that Saturday morning, exactly as he'd promised, and I watched him ask his mother about the Escobars directly, without softening the question the way he had softened everything else about her for as long as I'd known him. Geraldine's answer came slowly, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she never once drank from. The Escobar's daughter had needed a surgery insurance wouldn't cover, and Geraldine, watching a family she'd known for 20 years, quietly panic over a bill they couldn't pay, had decided in that moment that she possessed a solution nobody else in the room did. My name, my reputation, a signature she could imitate closely enough to pass. It had worked. Nobody had questioned it. And somewhere in the 2.5 years since, the specific crisis had changed, but the tool she reached for never did. I spent that Saturday with Nathaniel, Geraldine, and Harold at their kitchen table again, but this time with a legal pad instead of donation letters between us. Geraldine had, true to her word, kept records of every dollar, 31 families in total across 2.5 years, the Escobars among the earliest and largest. We drafted a plan together, full repayment where money had been spent rather than banked, a personal letter from Geraldine to every family disclosing exactly what had happened and returning whatever remained, and a separate, private conversation with the Escobars, specifically, since their daughter's surgery had already happened and there was no way to undo the fact that her care had been funded through fraud, however well-intentioned. "I'll write every letter myself," Geraldine said, and for the first time since Tuesday, she looked at me directly instead of down at the table. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for this, Renee. I know I don't get to ask that yet. But I need you to know I understand exactly what I put at risk. Not just legally, but you, personally, at your job, with people who trusted you." "I'm not ready to tell you it's fine," I said, and I meant it. It isn't fine. You used my name and a child's medical photo without asking either of us, and you did it for 2.5 years, before any of us knew. I don't know yet what this does to how I see you at Sunday dinner, or whether I can hand you my son the same way I did last week. I need time for that, the same way you're going to need time to make this right with 31 families. Harold reached over and put his hand over his wife's on the table. The same rag from 2 days ago still folded on the counter behind him, untouched. "We'll do it her way," he said quietly. "Every letter, every dollar." Monday morning, Bethany filed her report exactly as she'd told me she would, flagging an unauthorized use of a patient photograph, under active resolution by the family involved, with restitution already underway to every affected household. The hospital's compliance office opened a formal review of how the image had left our system in the first place, tightening consent protocols for any photo used outside a patient's own chart, which felt like the one part of this whole ordeal that might genuinely protect someone else's child down the road. 3 weeks later, I sat with Geraldine while she sealed the last of the 31 letters, and I watched her hands shake slightly as she pressed the envelope closed. 31, she said, mostly to herself. I used to tell myself I was only ever going to do it once. "I know," I said. I didn't tell her it was forgiven. I told her the truth instead. "I'm still deciding what kind of grandmother I want you to be to my children after this. I haven't decided you don't get to be one. I also haven't decided you get to be exactly the one you were before Tuesday." She nodded, and for once, she didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance the way she always has for as long as I've known her. She just sat there, holding the weight of that sentence, and let it be enough for one afternoon. Harold sold 2 of his late father's antique radios that month to help cover what the family's own savings couldn't. A small, quiet sacrifice he never once mentioned to me directly. I only found out from Nathaniel, weeks later, and something about that detail has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from this whole ordeal. The way real accountability so often happens in small, unglamorous rooms, with no one watching, long after the version of the story anyone else will ever hear has already ended. I still don't know, months later, whether what we did was justice, or simply the gentlest version of accountability a family can manage to hand each other without breaking entirely. The Escobars accepted Geraldine's letter and her apology with more grace than I think I would have offered in their position. 2 other families never responded at all. And every Sunday, when my mother-in-law still sets a plate for my son and calls him her sweet boy, I find myself watching her a little more closely than I used to, waiting to see which version of her shows up at that table. The woman who spent 30 years being the one who shows up for everyone else's crisis, or the woman who decided, quietly and for 2.5 years, that my name was hers to use whenever she believed the cause was good enough to justify it. I've thought a lot about why this particular betrayal hit differently than others I've lived through. It wasn't malice dressed up as love. It was love, genuinely felt, that let itself believe the ends justified using someone else's name, someone else's reputation, and a child's private medical image without permission. I still don't know if that makes it easier to forgive or harder, and I suspect I'll be turning that question over for a long time. I want to know what you would have done in that kitchen, holding those letters, looking at the woman who has called herself your children's grandmother for 9 years. Would you have given her 48 hours the way I did, or would you have walked straight to compliance the moment you understood what she'd done? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. I read every single one, and this particular story has split people right down the middle every time I've shared pieces of it. If this is the first time you've spent an evening with me, my name is Renee Winters, and my life has never once gone the quiet, predictable way I planned it to. I've learned that the people closest to you are capable of surprising you in both directions, sometimes toward betrayal, and sometimes, like my nurse Bethany did this year, toward a kind of integrity that saves you from yourself before you even know you need saving. There is always another chapter waiting in this family, and I promise you, it rarely stays calm for long. If this story kept you here until the very last word, do me a favor and hit that like button before you go. It tells me you want more stories like this one, and it costs you nothing but a second of your time. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on that notification bell so you never miss the next chapter of my life the moment it goes up, because I promise you, this family is far from finished surprising me. Share this video with anyone in your life who has ever had to decide whether protecting a family member was worth compromising their own name, their own integrity, or their own peace. And before you go, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. I love scrolling through and seeing exactly how far these stories travel, from small towns to big cities, and I read every single one of them, even the ones I don't get to answer. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. It wasn't an easy story to tell, and it isn't finished teaching me things about my own family. I'll see you in the next chapter.